Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm professor at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania, and I'm here as always with my long-standing friend, co-host, the Reverend Todd Pruitt of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Todd, we are under a whole heap of smoke that's been dumped on us from Canada this morning.
I saw that in the news.
Yes. I'm thinking we need to elect somebody who will build a big enough wall along the northern border to stop these clouds coming over from Canada.
I agree. I'm in Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, and the sky is hazy today. From it. It's not as bad as it is in New York and Pennsylvania, but even down here, there's a haze in the sky. I mean, I knew Canada was trouble for a long time, but now they're really meddling in our business, and so I think something's going to have to be done. I'm not suggesting a military invasion of Canada per se, but if it comes down to that, it won't take very long. I mean, let's face it, right?
Well, DC is blanketed because my youngest son is there, as you know, and that is suffering too. So, Anyway, we need to get on with the business of the day. It's a real thrill for me today to have as a guest on the program somebody whose writing I've admired for quite a while. I first came across her name in the British sort of daily online magazine of dissenting thought, Unheard, which is an e-zine devoted neither to the right nor to the left, but devoted to getting opinions at angular opinions on things that provoke thought. So you'll have, for example, the Marxist critic Terry Eagleton will write provocative pieces for them with regularity. And you'll have various other voices that dissent from the emerging kind of consensus in the West. And among those voices, one of the most regular and one of the most consistently entertaining and stimulating is that of Mary Harrington. Mary is a graduate of the University of Oxford, but as I said to her before the program started, nobody is perfect. And she is also a contributing editor at Unheard. Her work has appeared in the Times of London, the Spectator. By the way, I do recommend the British Spectator to our listenership. It's often has very, very thoughtful commentary on the way the world is. The New Statesman, which if you come from Britain, know it's kind of the anti-Spectator. That's the sort of the Spectator with a more left-wing slant. The Daily Mail, and of course, the magazine where I myself serve as a contributing editor, First Things. Most recently, she is the author of a book that every year, for some reason, Catholic World Report asked me to name my book of the year. And I'm thinking I've already read my book of the year this year, Mary Harrington's Feminism Against Progress, which is a wonderful take on the state of the world in which we live, and has also coined a most memorable phrase, which I hope to explore a little bit later: meet Lego Gnosticism.
Yes.
If ever there was a phrase that I wished I had the wit to think up, it would have been that one. I have been quoting that and attributing it in lectures ever since I read it. So I'm gonna try
to work that into a sermon. Actually, when I first read the term, I howled out loud because it was so perfect.
It captures it brilliantly. And somebody sent me a picture a few weeks ago of a box of chopped up pork and referred to it as a Peppa Pig jigsaw. And I immediately thought of Mary's book when I saw that. So Mary, I don't want to sound like too much of a fanboy here, but it really is wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Carl.
So Mary, one of the things that really caught my eye, your book is a sort of you're advocating a kind of what might be called reactionary kind of feminism, which is a feminism that is trying to recapture the importance of what it means to be a woman, but in a way that doesn't regress to old kind of cultural stereotypes. And one of the things that grabbed my imagination early in the book was your account of how your life was changed by the birth of your daughter. And you express this in a stunning way when you say that, I can't remember exactly the phrase you used, but essentially you say that after your daughter was born, you couldn't stop believing she was part of your body. And that brought with it significant obligations and a significant transformation of how you thought about the world. And that struck me as a very striking inversion of the usual feminist idea that, hey, what's in my womb is just a part of my body. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit for us. It was a very powerful moment of personal testimony.
Well, I suppose up until that point, I'd more or less taken for granted the modern liberal feminist belief, which was that pursuing women's interests meant pursuing maximal freedom, which generally understood as freedom from things, freedom from any obligation to be a certain way, to do certain things, to act or dress according to certain norms or stereotypes, and to pursue and freedom from constraints in terms of professional choices or personal choices or really on any front you care to name. That was my understanding of it. But that necessarily means a sense of separateness from everything. You know, if you're going to be free to do anything you want, you know, that implies that you're a sort of a measure of detachment from everyone and everything around you. And what I found so disorienting about becoming a mum was that this was it was obviously, becoming a mum is a fundamental aspect of being a woman. I mean, only women can give birth, so it's difficult to argue that there isn't something constitutively, definitively female about becoming a mother. And yet the experience of being a mother just completely blew that idea of separateness is always good out of the water. I mean, I'm definitely not the only mum I've ever heard describe it as feeling like you've grown an extra limb. That's now, and it really does feel existentially like that. Certainly, it did for me, and other mothers of my acquaintance have corroborated this. It's as though you've grown an extra internal organ or another arm or a leg or something. And I mean, if you feel like your own arm or leg is in danger, you'll move heaven and earth to avert injury or damage to your own arms and legs. And it feels, and when it comes to possible threats to your own baby, it's that visceral. It really is that she just felt like an extension of me, and for 9 months she literally was. She was inseparable. She was part of my own viscera, and that feeling just doesn't go away overnight. I mean, I think for me, she didn't really stop feeling like a separate person for a solid 1.5 to 2 years at all. And I mean, even now, the mum Bluetooth is still going strong 6 years later. It changes over time, but that very intense feeling of merger just goes on for a very long time after birth. And I mean, from a sort of practical evolutionary point of view, it makes sense. And the same phenomenon is visible in plenty of mammal species other than humans. And it's an adaptive part of looking after a very vulnerable, dependent young creature. That sense of merger with your baby, but from a philosophical point of view, from a metaphysical, from a political point of view, I suppose you could say, it's one thing being a sheep and being willing to go fight to the death to protect your newborn lamb, but it's another thing being a woman in the 21st century, having internalized a century odd, a solid 60 years of second wave feminism, and trying to process that experience. It's incredibly disorienting. Because what it's the physiological experience, it was in sort of neurochemical. I mean, it is literally a neurochemical transformation. It happens at all kinds of not very conscious at all levels. And I'm trying to square that with an ideology which says that in my interests, the exact opposite of that ought to be true as far as possible. And I'm thinking this just doesn't add up. I'm missing something here. So there's either there are either feminist voices that I haven't found yet who have been sidelined from the mainstream, or there's something missing in feminism generally, or something's off here. How can the entirety of feminism have a mother-shaped blind spot? And I mean, being a nerd, of course, I went digging, and it turned out that all of those things are true. There are maternal feminists who have been sidelined, and that started me thinking, well, why have they been sidelined? How have they been sidelined? How did we end up here? And then, to cut a very long story, very relatively short, I went all the way down that rabbit hole and came to the conclusion that what we think of as feminism isn't really an evidence of progress as such, but more of women's responses to new technological developments since the beginning of industrialization. And that second wave feminism in particular, this version of freedom feminism, which I just internalized as the entirety of feminism, is not the entirety of feminism. It is in fact what was left on the battlefield after the two poles which had characterized feminism throughout the industrial era were resolved into one at the end of the industrial era, which was in fact 50 years ago. So I should probably unpack that for you a little bit. So to come at that again from the other end of the telescope, the thesis I found myself at, somewhat surprised to find blinking in was that we no longer live in the industrial era. We have in fact been in a new era, which I've called the cyborg era, for some 50 years. And what marches under the banner of feminism in the cyborg era is in fact something more accurately described as biolibertarianism, as a libertarianism of the body, which characterizes itself as feminism and has hitched itself to the coattails of women's emancipation and has expanded from women's emancipation into the emancipation of everyone, really from the givens of our own bodies. And is now waging an all-out assault on the idea of human nature as such, which to my eye is mostly benefiting big pharma and big business and is not doing a huge amount for anybody else. Mm-hmm. And that in the course of that, a great deal of what had previously been a hugely rich and important part of a just and appropriate feminist movement, which flourished during the industrial era, which is to say all of those voices who are advocating for women as embodied human beings in relation to our children and our families and our neighborhoods and our communities had been effectively memory holed because it lost the battle. But the reason we don't hear about it is because the winners write the history books. It's just as simple as that. So that's my thesis, which I think I've sort of told backwards and then forwards and then sideways. But I hope it makes sense.
It does make sense.
It does. And it's funny. I spent the last couple of days wading through Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment. And what struck me is how much of the early critical theorists, how much of this they sort of spotted. Now, I think they would move in very different directions to the three of us. But, technology seems absolutely critical. And one of the things I liked about your book, Mary, and Todd may want to comment on this, is you picked up on something I completely missed when I wrote my book on the self. And that is I treated the trans issue as part of the political LGBTQ issue, which it is. But of course, it's also really a subset of transhumanism, which I think is what you are pointing towards in the statement that you just made.
Well, absolutely. And I don't think you need to take my word for that. You can also take the word of Martine Rothblatt, who is a leading transhumanist and transgender activist, and who explicitly connects those two issues in a 2011 book called From Transgender to Transhuman. I mean, it does, which does what it says on the tin. It sets out the game plan for getting from trans rights activism to transhumanism more generally.
Yeah, which is available online, I think, for anybody who wants to check that out. That's it's a powerful book. Todd.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me that was so helpful as the book is eminently readable, and yet I kept having all of these sort of new explosions of thought that were going off in my mind as I was reading it, and I'm taking notes in the margins because, Mary, I pastor a church with lots of people in it. We have lots of youth and lots of college students and their parents. So I'm constantly fielding questions about things that they are encountering along the lines of the very things you're writing about here and write about also in your columns. Incidentally, I don't know if it would surprise you or not to know that when I posted Carl's review of your book a couple of weeks ago, I heard from various Presbyterian pastors who said, "Oh, I've been reading her for a while now. I've really enjoyed her." And so you've got these Presbyterian pastors who've actually been following you and have appreciated your book. And I think the reason why Christians like myself and Carl find your book so important is because of the, if I can use this phrase, the intersection of a lot of what I do with some of the very points you're making and the things that I'm trying to explain to people. I'm now actually able to explain better because of a lot of the categories I've gotten a hold of from your book. We were talking about this before we came on air, but I'm going to get to it before Carl has a chance. You have this wonderful line as you're explaining kind of the big picture of what progress is, and you call it progress theology, which I thought was a very helpful term, and I want you to kind of unpack that in a moment. But you make this great statement. In this vision, our bodies cease to be independent, sexed, and sentient, and are instead reimagined as a kind of meat Lego, built on parts that can reassemble at will. First of all, the statement "meat Lego" is one of the best ones I've run across in a while. But unpack that a little bit, because, and I think as we talk about transhumanism, we're starting to get into that. I mean, we have this unusual phenomenon where, Martine Navratilova is all of a sudden a figure of the right, because she says things like, maybe men shouldn't compete in women's sports, and now all of a sudden Martine Navratilova has been reconfigured as a sort of a menacing right-wing figure over this, and it's because she's made statements that kind of contradict with the whole meat Lego kind of concept that you point out. But I wonder if you would unpack that a little bit about what you're getting at there.
Sure. The dog has just wandered in to say hello.
We're dog lovers, don't worry.
I got two in my house.
Yeah, and so if you hear grumbling in the background, that's what's going on. Sure. So meat Lego. I tend to sort of mean first and ask questions later. And it just seems, it seemed like an appropriate way of describing what seems to me a completely back to front way of looking at what bodies are and what they do, in the sense that, we are entire organisms and we have developmental pathways and we have a beginning and a middle and an end. I mean, this is true of all living creatures. We're born somewhere in fairly predictable ways. And, we have of course, all of our lives are different in wonderful ways, but there are common developmental pathways, and puberty follows the paths it follows depending on which sex you are. And, babies are made. We all know how babies are made, or we used to. And the human lifespan hasn't changed a great deal since biblical times. Not really. All these things. There are the template is fairly robust, and evolutionary psychology has filled in a lot of the shades and so on. And the sort of meat Lego worldview, which begins from the premise that we can and should be maximally free, looks at all of this and says these are all constraints on what I could be. There is an I that's separable from all of this, which I'm just going to posit, and my leap of faith will be to say that this exists. I can't prove it, but it exists. And on that basis, I will claim that I will reimagine all of these normative templates and pathways and organismic developmental features of the human being as expressive options that I can switch on and off. And this becomes thinkable in direct proportion to our technological ability actually to do that, or to give ourselves the impression that we can do that. And I've argued in the book that this really begins with the contraceptive pill. I've developed that argument actually since I wrote the book. At which point it became imaginable for the first time that reproductive processes, which had previously just been hard limits on particularly the behaviour of women, but really the behaviour of everybody, could now be switched on and off, and indeed the contraceptive pill does do that remarkably effectively. I believe it's 98% effective, or is it? It might be a bit less than that. Anyway, it's fairly effective. Mm-hmm. So you take a pill, and what was previously a hard limit is suddenly not. And this is, I mean, of course, this is it's a seismic cultural moment as well as being a seismic, sexual, and it's an absolutely transformative moment, because at that point it becomes thinkable that we can rewrite our organismic processes at this absolutely fundamental level and from there, having accepted in principle that you can do this, it's difficult to see why you should stop at female fertility. If we've accepted in principle that it's a legitimate part of medicine, not just to fix things which are broken, but to break things which are working properly, for example, fertility, in the interests of desire, why should we not extend that infinitely? At that point, once you've accepted that in principle, why should we not extend that to remodeling our secondary sex characteristics in line with individual expressive preferences, for example? Why should we not extend that to remodeling the human form altogether in line with expressive preferences? This is really the Martine Rothblatt position. Rothblatt is arguing for freedom, what the book describes as freedom of form, which is and which is framed in that text very much as an issue of emancipation, if you like, the ultimate liberal issue, which is liberation from human embodiment into whatever form is desired. And which throws up all sorts of metaphysical questions that we don't really have time to get into here. But really, what I'm trying to unpack is how you get from what I see as a basic premise, which has some common characteristics with the ancient Gnostic heresy, which is to say the idea that matter is inferior and evil and can and should be overcome by a self of pure idea, or a posited self of pure idea, which is believed capable of being freed from the world of matter. I mean, there are some differences with the in the neo-Gnostic worldview, which we may or may not have time to get into, and then extends that paradoxically, uses that to embrace an incredibly materialistic understanding of what that liberation would look like, and does so. I think, probably for me, to my eye, the most salient difference between the ancient Gnostic heresy and the modern one is that the ancient heresy, the ancient Gnostics believed that there was a world of forms. They wanted to get back to the Platonic world of pure ideas, which they thought existed and was higher and better. Whereas the modern neo-Gnostic idea seems to be that there are no forms. There is no such thing as human nature. There's no such thing as an ideal, a world of ideas. All there is a world of pure expressive desire, and we ought to emancipate ourselves from the corrupt, imperfect world of matter to pursue, I don't know what, but to pursue whatever it is that we want, whatever that happens to be. It's a sort of it's bizarrely empty compared even to the Gnostic heresy.
Yeah. And it's such an incongruity, and you point this out, because we are talking about a kind of Gnosticism here, and yet it seems to issue forth, at least in its contemporary expression, in almost entirely material expressions.
Yeah, I think that's the very dark thing about it, in the sense that it's structurally inseparable from what it claims to be oppressed by. So there's it has its own defeat built into it, and it has its own destruction and despair built into it. In a way that I think is that there's something incredibly cruel about setting people on that path and then telling them that it's going to be their salvation. There's something very, very dark and cruel about that.
Yeah.
Well, one question, my sort of last question here is this: in some ways the book is quite bleak. And I'm frequently accused of writing pretty bleak stuff myself. But where do you see grounds for hope?
Oh, there's always grounds for hope. I mean, there's the doomer optimist perspective, which says that the model of technocapital, which I've been critiquing in the book, is structurally antinatalist to the point where it's just going to delete itself from the meme pool eventually, because it doesn't reproduce itself. In fact, it does the exact opposite. It shreds its own reproductive potential. It's sort of self-cannibalizing economic and cultural order. So one outcome is just that it ends up self-devouring to the point that the only people left are the Amish and the Mennonites who never got on that train. That's one possible outcome, and it's not it's not completely impossible. I guess there's a whole bunch of more upbeat possibilities, including that. Well, I mean, where I like to see hope is in my conviction that it doesn't matter how hard you try and abolish human nature, and it finds a way. Human nature comes back. I mean, I've tried to show through a bunch of different lenses in the book how attempts to abolish human nature in transhumanist terms, for example, in the relations between men and women, the relationships between mothers and babies, and actually the meat Lego relation with our own bodies, never succeeds in abolishing human nature. All it does is reorder our nature to the market. And my hope, where I see hope, is that after people try that and then they realize it sucks, and they look for other ways of living which are less empty and less self-destructive. It's my hope that more of the generations after mine, will get there more quickly than I did. I reached escape velocity just about in time, but I came out with a lot of battle scars. And I would, if there's one thing I hope from writing the book, is that there'll be younger women out there who'll get out before I did, and having taken fewer dents. So, but I see it happening. I mean, I see a generation of younger women who are very much more realist about the trade-offs between freedom and obligation, between love and duty, between embodiment and emancipation, and between meaning and power, I suppose. I should say young men and women, but this is something that you have to think about very much more concretely, I think, if you're a woman who wants a family, because there are points where that zero-sum competition between love and liberty is very intense. Certainly, if you want to have a family at all, there are some points where it's just straight up zero-sum. And I think there's for a number of decades we haven't been very honest about that. But I see a generation of young women coming through who are very much more grounded and very much more pragmatic about that, and who are thinking in practical terms from the get-go about how to order their lives such that they're not having it all, but they're well set up to have a lot, which I just think is a sane and healthy way to think about it. And those people exist, and I'm sure they're subcultural pockets at the moment. But it's amazing. You've got to start somewhere, haven't you? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, if what those people are creating is subcultures which have the ability to flourish, then they will flourish, even if the remainder of the culture is busy cannibalizing itself around them. They stand a much better chance of being what's left standing at the end of the day.
It is. Well, our guest today has been Mary Harrington. She is the author of Feminism Against Progress. And as Carl mentioned at the beginning of our program, you can also follow Mary's work in various other venues, and it's well worth doing that. Our listeners, who are largely Christian, will, if you read this book, and I would encourage you to do that, I hope one of the thoughts you walk away with is that truth is robust, and that those of us who look at the world through a biblical lens will find so much in this book that resonates with us about the goodness of the human body, the coherence of the mind and the body, that we are not just minds afloat, nor are we just simply meat Legos, but there is a coherence to our createdness that is unavoidable. And you'll be encouraged to think deeply about our createdness and how we've been made. And I would encourage you to get this book into the hands of some folks who have maybe believed the very emotionally appealing but ultimately empty narrative of what Mary Harrington calls progress theology, and give them a chance to grapple with the much better but more complex, but much better narrative that coheres closely with truth and the truth that we see woven throughout nature. So it's been a good discussion. We could go on, but I would encourage our listeners to go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and there you'll be able to register for a free copy of this important book by Mary Harrington, Feminism Against Progress. And while you're there, if you'd like to make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do so that the Alliance can continue to offer good and thoughtful and stimulating content like this. Well, we are so thankful that you chose to join us today, and we look forward to being with you next time